Panworks, bringing ethics to life. Good evening. This is Pan Thinks, a production of Panworks. I'm Bill Lind, your host. Today, we're really fortunate to have with us Liv Baker, who's going to talk about what it means to know an animal. Liv Baker is a conservation behaviorist with a PhD in animal welfare science. She is a fellow as well as chair of our board at Panworks. She's research director for Mahout's Elephant Foundation, and she's also an adjunct professor of animal welfare science at the University of British Columbia. Without further ado, Liv, I want to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. And thanks to everyone for taking time out of your day to be here with us all. I'm going to share my screen, and Bill, just let me know if there are any issues once I do that. So before I get into the talk proper, I wanted to take the time to acknowledge Happy, who is depicted here in this photograph. So many of you may have heard that Happy was or died today. Happy was a solitary elephant at the Bronx Zoo. She was ripped from her home in Thailand, from the wild in Thailand in 1971, and has been in captivity since then, and has been a solitary elephant at the Bronx Zoo for the past 20 years. And since I'll be talking about elephants as we talk about knowing animals, I thought it was important to honor Happy and her life. But I also wanted to point out one of the media articles and the headline, because I think it really exemplifies the problem we have with our relationship with animals. And so you can see here, this is from the Associated Press. Happy, who taught researchers that elephants can recognize themselves, is euthanized. So it's about us, and we'll talk more about this. It's about what we get from the animals, and the headline really obliterates her own life. It's just her life in service of humans. An elephant stands at a crossroads. She pauses, her trunk rises, testing the air, not casually, but with the full attention of an animal reading the world. Her ears sweep forward, then back. She shifts her weight, takes a step in one direction, stops, then she commits to a path. What does she perceive in that moment? How does she hold memory of distant groves across seasonal time? What does the quality of the wind communicate to her about water, about other elephants, about the ripening of preferred foods, about human presence, about possibility? Her choice, when it comes, reflects the integration of multiple forms of knowledge: spatial memory accumulated over decades, social awareness of her family's needs and preferences, understanding of seasonal patterns, assessment of current conditions, and individual inclination shaped by a lifetime of particular experience. Perception, memory, emotion, and knowledge are not separate processes running in parallel. They are entangled dimensions of a unified way of being and knowing, and they belong entirely to her. That is where I want to begin today. Not with a problem, not with a gap in the literature, but with this elephant and what she knows. Animals are knowers. I think this is the most important and also the most underappreciated thing we can say about them. And I want to suggest that taking it seriously, not as a poetic gesture, but as a scientific and ethical commitment, changes almost everything downstream. How we think about well-being, how we think about autonomy, and how we think about what it means for us to know an animal at all. Those three things, well-being, autonomy, and knowing, are what I want to speak about with you today. My outlook is that you cannot think clearly about any one of them without thinking about the others. and that together they point toward a different kind of science of animal lives than the one we currently practice. Let's stay with the idea of animal knowing for a moment, because we tend to pass over it too quickly, acknowledging it in principle while our frameworks continue to treat it as peripheral. Let's think about what the elephant at that crossroads might actually know. She holds spatial memory of the landscapes accumulated over decades, the location of seasonal water sources, mineral deposits, fruiting trees, difficult terrain. She carries social knowledge of her family's dynamics, individual personalities, the needs and wants of specific others. She understands temporal patterns, the rhythms of seasons, the movement of other species, the signs that conditions are shifting. None of this knowledge is abstract or decontextualized for her. It exists in and through her ongoing engagement with a particular place, particular others, a particular life. It is embodied, relational, and situated, and it is genuinely hers. Let us also consider a salmon navigating thousands of miles of open ocean back to their natal stream. What guides that journey is not merely a chemical gradient, but something more integrated, olfactory knowledge of a specific place, built through embodied memory, inseparable from a temporal understanding of life cycles and seasonal change. The salmon knows their aquatic home through years of embodied experience, its varying temperatures, its flow patterns, its particular signatures. That knowing shapes their entire existence, and their journey home is an expression of this knowledge and of self. Or what about an orca who learns their pod's dialect through years of attentive listening and practice? The calls are not just sounds to be produced correctly. They encode social meaning, family lineage, individual identity, emotional states. Young orcas acquire not just the sounds, but the meanings embedded within them. And through that acquisition, they come to know themselves, in part, through animation of this inherited and collectively held knowledge. No single orca possesses their language fully. It lives in the social fabric of the pod, transmitted and subtly modified across generations. To know the dialect is to know who you are and where you belong. What I'd like to draw out from these examples is something that I think our scientific frameworks have been slow to accommodate. Animal knowledge is not a pale version of human knowledge, nor is it simply instinct dressed up in more palatable language. It is contextual, relational, embodied, and unified in ways that resist the fragmentation that our scientific methods tend to impose. When we measure, for example, latency, frequency, duration, when we isolate variables, count behaviors, we are not wrong exactly in doing so. They do offer insights, but we are working at the wrong level of description. The fragmentation thus exists in our methods, not in the animal's experience. This has consequences that run deeper than methodology. When we cannot see animal knowing, when we're not looking for it, when our frameworks render it effectively invisible, we end up with a picture of animal lives that is genuinely impoverished, not just ethically, but scientifically. We miss what is actually happening, and what we miss matters, not only for what we understand, but for what we then think we are permitted to do. Well-being, then, cannot be understood apart from animal knowing. They are entangled in ways that most welfare frameworks have not fully reckoned with. Animal welfare science emerged in the 1960s as a response to growing discomfort with industrial and large-scale animal use, factory farming in particular. It was, from the start, a science born of a specific context. Animals in conditions of high constraint with little agency, subject to human management. The 5 freedoms, freedom from hunger, from pain, from fear, from disease, the freedom to express normal behavior, emerged from the same moment as a framework for thinking about what animals in those conditions minimally deserved. They are essentially a list of negatives. And while our understanding of animal lives has evolved profoundly in the decades since, the five freedoms remains the major touchstone for welfare indicators and guidelines across most contexts. The logic is still largely one of mitigation. Reduce suffering, limit harm, remove the worst conditions. This was and still is important work, and it represents genuine moral progress. But the framework was shaped by the conditions that produced it, and that shaping has proven difficult to move beyond. The welfarist framework takes the conditions of animal use largely as given and asks how to make them less bad. It is structurally a science of mitigation, and mitigation, however necessary, is fundamentally different from an orientation of animal autonomy and agency. Consider the difference between asking whether an animal is free from pain and asking whether an animal is living well. These might seem like points on a continuum, the second simply going farther than the first, but I want to suggest they are not on the same continuum at all. The first question, and its positive welfare counterpart, does this animal have positive experiences, both remain within the same basic logic. The animal as recipient of conditions, better or worse, that we provide or withhold. The frame is still one of management, still one of conferral. Well-being, as I mean it, is something else. It is not a better set of conditions. It is what emerges when an animal can be a subject of their own life, when they can exercise their knowledge, act on their preferences, engage with their world on their own terms. The constituents of well-being on this account are not things we add. They are what agentic living is. In my own framework, which I call Spheres of Wellbeing, I try to capture this complexity. Well-being on this view is not a single thing, but an integrated set of dimensions. Physical health, shelter, safety, and nutrition as a foundation, but there's also the importance of behavioral repertoire, opportunity for what I call privileged behaviors, such as play, environmental engagement, the eco-social environment, emotional experience and positive affect, self-expression, knowledge acquisition through learning and exploration, opportunities for reasonable challenges, the animal's lived experience, their culture. These dimensions are dynamically connected, and crucially, they are situated. They look different for different animals in different contexts, shaped by their ecologies, by their relationships, and by their evolutionary legacy. What they share is that they all depend, in one way or another, on the animal's capacity to know and act from that knowing. Well-being, on this account, is not something administered to animals. It is something that emerges through their capacity to be subjects of their own lives. To understand what this integration actually looks like, let's stay with the elephant a little longer. Not at the crossroads this time, but moving through the forest in early dry season. The bamboo that sustained her family through the wet months is thinning. She has been here before, many times across many dry seasons. She knows which slopes hold moisture longest, which trees yield bark worth stripping, where a particular mineral-rich earth lies that the family has returned to for as long as anyone can remember. This knowledge is not abstract. It lives in her body, in the accumulated texture of seasons spent moving through this particular landscape. She pauses, reaches her trunk toward a stand of bamboo, assesses it, and moves on. A younger family member follows, watches, tries the same gesture. The matriarch, older and unhurried, is already moving toward a site she has not visited since the last dry season. The others follow. When they arrive and begin to feed, something shifts. The pace slows, the sounds change, calves play at the edges while adults eat. There is something recognizable in it, ease perhaps, or something close to satisfaction. What is happening here is not one thing. She is drawing on spatial memory and cultural knowledge passed down through generations. That is knowledge through learning and exploration and culture. She is reading the social landscape of the group, attending to who needs what and when. That is the eco-social environment. The young elephant watching and imitating is acquiring not just technique, but understanding. That is how knowledge travels across time. The effort of navigating a landscape that is genuinely demanding, of assessing and discarding and persisting until she finds what she is looking for. That is what reasonable challenges means. Not hardship imposed from outside, but the texture of a world worth knowing, and the choice she makes at every step. This path, this site, this moment to pause is self-expression in the most fundamental sense. None of these dimensions is operating independently. They are not a checklist moving through in sequence. They are simultaneous, entangled, each shaping the others, which is why the spheres framework is built the way it is. What we are trying to capture is not a set of needs to be met, but a way of being alive that can only be understood whole. If well-being is constituted this way, through knowing, through agency, through active engagement with the world, then autonomy is not one dimension among others. It is the animating condition that makes the others possible. Without it, the spheres don't interact. They sit inert, like resources provided, but not lived. This is where I want to introduce a concept I've been developing for a number of years, which is what I call epistemic ontology. The term is a deliberate coinage, reorienting Nico Tinbergen's 4 questions of ethology, which are about phylogeny, evolutionary history, ontogeny or development, and survival and reproduction. Epistemic derives from episteme, which is knowledge and understanding, and ontology is the nature of being, of existence. Together, epistemic ontology is the nature of an animal's knowing and the entanglement of that knowing with who and how they are. The core claim is this: what an animal knows emerges through relationship with place, with others, with their own unfolding experience. And this relational knowing is not separable from who they are. Knowing and being are not distinct domains, but entangled phenomena that co-constitute each other through ongoing engagement. The elephant does not have knowledge of her landscape as a separate possession. She is, in some deep sense, partly constituted by that knowledge. Displace her, remove her from her social group, her friends, her family, confine her, and you are not just changing her circumstances, you are disrupting the conditions through which she knows and her capacity to express who she is. Epistemic ontology, then, is not just a philosophical claim. It is a reorientation of what we are looking at when we study animal lives, and it has direct implications for how we understand autonomy. Autonomy on this account is not simply freedom of movement or the absence of coercion, though of course those matter. It is the capacity to exercise one's knowledge over time, to make choices genuinely informed by one's own understanding, one's own memory, one's own preferences, and one's own social awareness. It is the expression of a self that has been constituted through relational engagement with a particular world. Which raises an immediate practical question. If autonomy is this, something interior, something constituted through relationship and experience, how do we study it? We cannot see the animal's inner states, but we can observe behavior. And behavior, interpreted with care, gives us access to something real and sensitive about those states, and thus about those animals. What I find most revealing is what I call the behavioral episode, a sequence of behavior that unfolds over time with an initiating event, a development, a resolution, or a non-resolution. An episode has an arc, a narrative. It captures how an animal moves through a moment, what draws them, what gives them pause, where they press forward, and where they turn away. Within that arc, there are behavioral transitions, moments when an animal shifts from one behavior to another on their terms. These are decision points, each one a small expression of agency, but it is the episode as a whole that holds the potential to show us something about knowledge, preference, and the depth of a life being lived that no single behavioral code could capture. There's something worth saying here. Behavior is extraordinarily sensitive when we work to understand it richly and deeply, with care, with humility, and without rushing to explanation. It reveals a great deal. And that understanding is never complete or static. It is ongoing and dynamic. It is something we return to and we revise. This is true not only in how we come to know other animals, but in how we come to know other humans and ourselves. The practice of attending carefully to behavior, sitting with what we see, resisting premature closure, is one of the more honest things we can do as scientists and as people, I think. Crucially, behavioral episodes will reveal varying degrees of autonomous expression. Whether an animal's knowing has space to find expression, whether they can initiate, modify, persist, or redirect on their own terms, is itself shaped by the circumstances of their life. Reading episodes with care means attending to that variation, not just what an animal does, but how much of what they do is genuinely theirs. An elephant who independently selects a foraging path, examines and rejects food items before choosing one, then navigates unfamiliar terrain. That sequence, read as a whole, is possibly consistent with an animal who knows their world and is acting from that knowing. We must remain open to reading episodes where knowing appears constrained, redirected, or overridden, and what that reveals about the life being lived. In my research with elephants in rewilding contexts, autonomy understood this way turns out to reveal something real about how well an animal is living. Elephants who express greater autonomy, who initiate, who explore, who make foraging decisions on their terms, reveal patterns that are recognizable as a life being actively inhabited. Their choices are not random. They draw on accumulated knowledge of place, on attunement to their social world, on an understanding of time and season that is their own. Autonomy here is not the absence of compromise so much as the presence of knowing exercised freely. Before we move on, I just want to pause on something because I think there's a risk in emphasizing well-being and flourishing, of painting a picture that is too smooth, too uniformly positive, or perceived as such. A life lived well is not a life without difficulty. It is not a life without grief or friction or the effort of navigating a world that does not always yield. Think about what an elephant's life actually contains. There are moments of tension, of compromise, of negotiation within families and between friends. There is the hard work of foraging in a landscape that is sometimes generous and sometimes not. There is the experience of loss. Elephants grieve, and that grief is real and sometimes prolonged. There are reasonable challenges. The effort of learning, the difficulty of a long migration, the complexity of maintaining social bonds across time and distance. An elephant who yields to a dominant family member is not suffering a loss of autonomy. She is living within the texture of her social world on terms that are hers, within relationships that are hers. This is what a whole life looks like, and it is categorically different from being constrained by us. Not all difficulty is the same, though. There's the difficulty that belongs to a life the friction of real relationships, the effort of navigating a world that doesn't always yield, and there's difficulty that is imposed from outside in service of purposes that are not the animal's own. The first is inseparable from flourishing. The second is a violation of it. This brings me to what I think is, in some ways, the most consequential question. If animals are knowers, and we know that they are, what does it mean for us to know them? Knowing an animal, in the minimal scientific sense, could mean having accurate information about their behavior, their biology, their social world, their history. But a science that takes animal knowing seriously has to ask for something more. It has to ask what behavioral expression means to the animal engaged in it, not just what it does or how it develops or why it evolved, but what it expresses about that animal's particular way of being in the world. And that is a question that requires a different quality of attention than we are accustomed to bringing. Consider how differently we understand the same behavior depending upon what we know about the animal expressing it. Take any behavior, foraging, resting, social contact, movement, what it means, what it tells us, whether it reflects a kind of flourishing or something more troubled, cannot be read from the behavior alone necessarily. The same expression can carry different significance depending upon the animal, their history, their social relationships, the spatial and temporal conditions of their life. Without attending to that context, we may not even recognize what we are looking at. Whether a behavior speaks to how that animal is living or signals something about the conditions of their life that asks more of us. How we read behavior, what we see, what we miss, what we assume has consequences for the animal whose behavior it is. That makes the quality of our attention a moral matter, not just a methodological one. The framework I've been building toward, epistemic ontology, is in part a response to this challenge. When we ask what an animal perceives, what they feel, and what they know regarding their own behavioral expressions, we are committing to a kind of interpretive seriousness. We are refusing to treat behavior as mere mechanism, as something to be recorded and categorized without asking what it means to the animal engaged in it. We are insisting that the animal's perspective, however difficult to access, is not peripheral to understanding their behavior, but central to it. This requires epistemic humility. The history of the behavioral sciences is, in part, a history of premature closure, of deciding too quickly that animals lack the inner lives we are reluctant to attribute to them, that taking animal experience seriously is sentiment rather than science. We now know that many of those closures were wrong. The question is whether we continue to make similar errors in domains we have been slow to enter. I think we do. And I think the cost is paid not just by the animals, but by the quality of our science. The history of behavioral science is, in a certain sense, a history of confident lines drawn and then redrawn. Capacity after capacity that was declared absent in animals, planning, grief, play, culture, theory of mind, was later found to be present once someone asked the question differently, looked at a different species, or simply looked more carefully. However, each time the boundary moved, it moved with the same confidence that had placed it there. We declared the question settled, and we were wrong. This pattern should give us pause, not because science doesn't progress, but because the cost of those premature closures was paid by the animals we were wrong about long before the correction came. I also want to say something about where knowledge of animals comes from, our knowledge production, because I think we have tended to draw the circle too narrowly. Situated relational knowledge of animal lives has existed in many forms long before Western behavioral science formalized its methods. The Karen people of northern Thailand, for instance, conceptualized the relationship between humans and elephants not in terms of location or classification, for example, wild versus domesticated, but in terms of relationship itself. The distinction between a wild elephant and a tame one in Korean frameworks is a distinction about the quality of a relationship, not a property of the animal in isolation. I raise this not to romanticize that relationship, which has its own complexities, violations, and contradictions, but because it points to something important. How we frame our relationship to other animals shapes what we are able to know about them. The orientation we bring, whether we approach animals as objects to be classified or as subjects we are in relationship with, is not epistemologically neutral. It determines what we can see. What this points towards, I think, is something that frameworks alone cannot provide. Knowing an animal well, in the sense I've been speaking about, requires more than the right theoretical orientation. It requires time. It requires presence. It requires the kind of sustained, attentive relationship in which an animal's particularity becomes visible. Their individual history, their preferences, the specific texture of how they move through their world. The Karen mahouts who have spent lifetimes alongside particular elephants know things about those elephants that short-term observation cannot reveal, not because they have different methods per se, but because they have been paying attention long enough for the animal to become known. That is a different kind of knowledge than what most research designs allow for, and it raises a question that I think the field has been slow to sit with. What would it mean to build scientific practice around that kind of attention rather than around the efficiencies that make it impossible? What I'm asking for ultimately is not more rigor at the expense of care, nor more care at the expense of rigor, as though those two were in tension. They're not. This is a false dichotomy. A science that takes animal knowing seriously is more rigorous and more honest about what it is doing. It asks different questions, not just what animals do, but what they know in doing it. Not just how behavior functions, but what it means to the animal expressing it. Not just whether animals are suffering, but whether they are living well. And it reaches for different methods, one sensitive to context, to individuality, to the temporal unfolding of a life. But, and this is a crucial but, it also accepts, it demands different limits. And this is where knowledge production, again, comes under scrutiny. If animals are knowers, if they have interior lives that engage with the world, preferences shaped by experience, ways of being that can be supported or disrupted, then that recognition places demands on us. It constrains, rightly, what we can do to them in the name of our knowledge production. It requires us to sit with the difficulty of accessing subjective experience rather than overriding it for human convenience, human knowledge, and human privilege. I want to close not with a summary, but with what I think follows from everything I've spoken about and what it asks of us. Taking animals seriously as knowers is not a position that leaves our fields intact. It doesn't add a consideration to existing frameworks. It shifts the ground those frameworks stand on. The questions change, the methods change. What counts as success changes, and what we are willing to do in the name of knowledge changes. Because an animal who knows, who has an interior life that engages with the world, who can flourish or fail to flourish, is not a subject we can use without remainder. What shifts when we start from animal knowing is the entire orientation of the work. This is not a refinement of existing frameworks. It is a different starting place. This asks something real of us as scientists, as practitioners, as people who share the world with other animals and make decisions constantly about what that sharing looks like. But I think these are necessary asks. And I think that being willing to engage with them and to sit with the difficulty of what they demand is itself a kind of commitment to the animals and to the integrity of the work. When we spend enough time attending carefully to animals, really attending with the quality of attention I've been talking about, something happens. we begin to apprehend something about who they are, not everything, not without error, but something real, something particular to those individuals that we couldn't have arrived at in any other way. And once we've had that experience, it becomes very difficult to go back to treating animals as data sources, as subjects in the experimental sense, as means to scientific ends. The attention itself is transformative. And what it transforms is not just the science, but our relationships to the animals themselves. Thank you.
This is wonderful. That was amazing. Just amazing. And now it's time for us to have a conversation about this wonderful presentation. Just to get the ball rolling, I want to ask probably the
No
question.
hard questions, Bill.
No hard questions. So, what do you say to those people who claim that you're being anthropomorphic? You're anthropomorphizing animals. And I'm asking that in two senses. One sense is about their claims that you are anthropomorphizing animals, but also the deeper meaning of anthropomorphism that you've talked about elsewhere.
Yeah. One, and this is an answer or a response I give to students and others, is of course I'm anthropomorphizing. I have no, and bear with me because I'm going to have more to say, but of course I'm anthropomorphizing. We have no choice but to anthropomorphize as humans. That is the lens through which we see the world. It is a point of departure. It is our starting place for how we understand and relate to others. I essentially anthropomorphize you, Bill, because I'm using my position, my lived experience, my embodied knowledge as a human to relate to you. So I might be projecting onto you, right, my understanding of the world. But again, I use that as a point of departure, and my ability to understand and get to know you better and make more meaningful interpretations about you is because I'm in relationship with you. I come to know you, right? I revise, I revisit, I think about. I don't just settle on, oh, because I respond to a situation this way, Bill must be as well. Because, right? And so I say, yes, absolutely anthropomorphize. Don't deny that, because to deny that is to deny the fact that we're a human. But again, it's a point of departure. Use it to relate, but then try to come to know that other being, right? Come to know them in their context. What species are they part of? What shapes their world? And that's the being situated in evolutionary legacy, but also knowing that individual in their context. And this is not something alone that I think of, right? There's a whole theory of critical anthropomorphism, right? The uncritical anthropomorphism is the uninterrogated anthropomorphism. So, but the critical anthropomorphism is understanding that that is the lens through which we see the world, but understanding that it should be a point of departure. It should be a reference point for understanding others. That's my answer to that question.
Thank you. That's wonderful. That's very, very helpful. Folks, let's have questions and discussions. Please just use the raise hand function down there, and let's hear your thoughts and
or we
questions
could just say
for
nice
Liv.
things about animals. It doesn't even.
We can do that too. Jahendra, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. That was amazing. I just wanted to share a thought, which I think is tangential to what you've been talking about. I was reading this book called Animal Rights by Mark Rowlands.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were talking about anthropomorphizing. And, in the book, he talks about consciousness and how animals respond to stimuli very much the same way we do. The same parts of the brain get activated with the same frequencies. And so, once again, we are using tools that we kind of have used on ourselves to define consciousness and, response to stimuli. So in that sense, we are trying to compare ourselves to animals by, once again, anthropomorphizing, right? We are trying to assess if animals behave or respond the same way to stimuli that we do. But they do. And so that's just further justification to allow animals the right of well-being, or to give them an opportunity for well-being, because they respond to stimuli in the environment the same way we do, the same stress responses, etc. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, always what comes to my mind when we talk about, again, knowledge production is the lives of those animals that produce that knowledge, and thinking about the burden I feel we have as researchers to be more creative in the ways we go about understanding others, and that knowledge itself is not justification enough for that kind of research, especially if it means a life of captivity, invasive treatments, and so forth.
Adam?
Brilliant, Liv, as expected. Thank you so much. There were some really profound sort of statements throughout that I'm going to have to get off you. Because they articulated points about knowing animals very clearly and very succinctly. So thank you for that. This, I suppose, the people here who have come here are probably either already like with you in understanding and knowing animals, and probably encouraging others to build a close understanding and close connection with animals, and through individual animals and through knowing individual animals. How do we do that for the many people who I think, if you ask most people, they have some care. I think there's a stat I'm pulling out of air that's about 96% of people care about animals, right? You'll care about animal suffering. They don't like it when animals suffer. And they know that animals suffer, right? They have some sort of acknowledgement that animals live and experience the world and are someone rather than something. But the conveniences of life, the structures and systems of our world sort of encourage people to maintain a very resource-based relationship with other animals, an objectification of other animals. And that's very hard to break down, right? How do we, but I believe that this close relationship, this deep seeing, this intimacy, and this internalization of who an animal is perhaps one way to break down these harmful relationships that we and dominating relationships that we force upon other animals. How do you think that we can encourage people, support people, facilitate people to recognize and see other animals in their fulsomeness? Do you have any examples where that is something you've seen happen to people, or know of examples where that can be encouraged and developed within people? Because certainly for myself, it is exactly this. It is exactly what you're talking about, working close with animals in science that helped me see who they were and then understand what I was doing to them was wrong. And it was a step change in who I was and my thinking about animals,
Right.
understanding who they were. How do we do this?
You promised me no hard questions, Adam. No. So this might, you know me, well, if you know me, you know I tend to wend and let me know. And sometimes I don't wend back to the path, so let me know if I don't. So let me just start by, and this might be a bit of a cop-out, I don't know, but I should start by saying I've taken the path the only path I've been able to take as a small little speck in this world, right? This, given who I am, right? My personality, is to, and you know, if you know me and you were listening to during the talk, I'm unapologetic, right, about my position. I don't hedge, I don't qualify about what I think is true about animals and what should be true about our responsibility to other animals. And I think that is pretty powerful, right? Having voices like that, like I know you, Adam, and others I know very much here in this room, who are also unapologetic on behalf of animals, and not always feeling like we have to take on like the edge cases or the detractors, you know, rather than saying, this is the bar we are setting. Feel free to come up to this bar. And that's not about being idealistic or unrealistic. It's about a real belief that this is where we should be, right? And so this might be the cop out by saying like, well, I got to do what I got to do kind of thing, right? But maybe in a small way, I know that unapologetic approach is really important for people, especially people who are more uncertain or less confident about what they know is true or what they know is right about animals, especially when there are people in authority constantly trying to quash that, right? So the more voices that are strong and are unapologetic, I think is important. And so again, I don't know if that's a full answer to that question, but that is a true answer for that. And in terms of examples, I mean, they're the small examples of the small but rising voices, right? That people can turn to and start to listen to and start to silence out, right? Those with incorrect thinking. So that's my response, Adam. I don't know what you think of that, or if you want to push me a little bit more, but
No, that's useful. I appreciate that, and I think that that being unapologetic, a lot of animal people, that is a hard thing to actually develop. That unapologetic response to people denying or pushing back or vilifying a
right.
compassionate and considerate position for animals. It's not an easy position to hold strongly and unapologetically in the face of all of the pushback that you often get. Yeah, so thank you.
I know.
Joanne, before I go to you, I want to follow up on Adam's question. Liv, I think it might be helpful for folks to hear about your experience when you first went to Thailand and started working on rewilding elephants there. Because there you, if I recall the story correctly, you were navigating differences about relationships with animals and what you originally thought was right and what you came to believe was right in their relationship with the Karen people. But that hasn't affected your unapologetic stance. And so understanding how that I don't want to say lack of apology, that strong position negotiating difference, I think would be helpful for all of us.
Sure. So does it have to do with the drag chains in particular, Bill? Is that what you were
I was thinking a
of?
little bit, I was thinking of the drag chains as perhaps being the most emblematic of those. I think that's the time in space in which your concept of reasonable compromises starts to form.
Yeah. And also really shifting from a understanding of welfare to well-being as well. So some of you might know this, some of you don't. So the elephants in Thailand, it's not true just for Thailand. This is the case in Nepal and in Myanmar, for example. So the Asian elephants that are owned, particularly if they're owned by indigenous communities, such as the Karen communities, there's a essentially a management tradition of using what's called a drag chain. So a drag chain is placed on a back leg, an ankle essentially, of an elephant, adult elephant. The size of the chain, the length of the chain, really varies depending upon the size of the elephant. I've done, I'll get to what was really informative about this to me in a second, but just to give you a sense of the drag chain. I did a gait analysis on elephants, and these are elephants, so even though they're legally owned, these are elephants that are living in native forest. And so they're navigating the forest terrain, very dense vegetation. And the drag chains have been used for hundreds of years, and chains, the material has altered, but they're used for a couple of reasons. One, they're used for tracking. So the mahouts, the Karen mahouts, will use them to follow the drag lines left behind to find where the elephants are in the forest. And they're also used to, when needed, tether the elephant. Sometimes when an elephant is wandering from the forest into a cornfield nearby, and to minimize conflict, there might be a farmer who's able to tether that elephant to a tree. Now, keep in mind, they're often tethered to small trees, a tree that the elephant can remove without much trouble. So I was asked when I was first started working in Thailand with rewilded Asian elephants, I was asked by Mahout's Elephant Foundation to come out to learn about these elephants, to learn about the Karen communities they worked with, to visit the forests. And so this was the first time that I encountered a drag chain, and I came to it with the perception of like, chain bad, right? Like this is not good. What is this? But I trusted the people who asked me to come out and were working with these communities. So I'm like, okay, let's see what these drag chains are all about before I rain down a conclusion upon this situation. So I watched how the elephants move with the drag chains, navigating pretty complicated, complex terrain. I even did a gait analysis study, research assistants, and me did that. And watched, so a gait analysis is, how are they walking? What does their gait look like compared to elephants and the same elephants without the drag chains on them? And there was no discernible difference. They're navigating that terrain without issue. They're able to lift the chain when needed, if it gets entangled, even briefly. And so I came to a conclusion that the physical nature of the drag chain was similar to us if we were wearing kind of like a heavy charm bracelet, which I kind of wouldn't want to wear. So I'm not saying every elephant loves to wear them. I'm not making a claim about the individual elephants and their perception about the drag chains, but I'm just making saying what the weight or the bulk of the chain is like for an animal of the size of an Asian elephant. And so this gets to the understanding of one, making sure that we're not projecting a notion of, in this case, welfare onto other animals without really understanding what it means for the lives of those animals. And so there was a lot of, there still is, but there's a lot of criticism around the use of drag chains. It falls under the all chains bad, as if all chains were equivalent, which they're not. There's a big difference between, an elephant who is on a few meter long chain on concrete in a horrible tourism camp versus a drag chain when they're moving freely through a forest. And so the distinction is really important, right? All chains are not the same thing. This is a distinction with a difference. And so a lot of these communities and the organizations that work with them on behalf of the elephants were being told, you have to get rid of the chains. We're not going to even give you money unless you get the chains are gone. And what you need to do instead is, in this native forest, build a nighttime corral, because usually the elephants they're moving freely, but there are some elephants that might be tethered at night to prevent them from moving into cornfield, sugarcane, what have you, which lead to a lot of conflict, right? And so instead of doing that tethering at night, for some of those elephants, build a nighttime corral. That's better, because we as humans, we don't want to think of the chains. Well, you know what that would have meant for those elephants? It would have greatly constrained how far they're able to move throughout the forest, because a nighttime corral is a permanent structure that can be in only one place in the forest. So those mahouts would have to go find those elephants. So then they wouldn't be able to go as far, because the mahouts can't travel as far, because the mahouts have to do other things, because they have other jobs, other responsibilities. So those elephants wouldn't be able to go as far, just so they could go back to a corral at night to make the humans feel better. So that would have effectively been worse welfare for those elephants. And I also remind you that if you think about individual personality, there are many elephants that would hate being confined physically in that way, in a corral. I mean, if I were an elephant, and certainly me as a human, I would be breaking through that corral. I'd much rather have a long charm bracelet attached to my leg as I'm moving through the forest than being constrained in where I can go and how far I can go, so I can go back to a nighttime corral to make the humans feel better. So I think if that's the example you're talking about, Bill, that was really eye-opening in terms of like the pause, right? To really understand the situation, to understand what I think is a reasonable compromise. These elephants that I work with, they are in relationship with these humans. And the mahouts I work with, I would say, have really good relationships with these elephants. That is not always the case. But just as an elephant can compromise with another elephant in their family, they can also understand a reasonable compromise with a human that they trust. And I think that the drag chain is an example of that.
Thank you for that. I really, really appreciate that. Very much so. Very much so. Joanna, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
all right.
And I
don't
didn't
worry.
mean to be rude. Please.
No, I thought that it was a very instructive example, and I will be thinking about that in other contexts. So thank you for that, Liv. That was very intuitive, and I really enjoyed that example. One is a comment, and I have to say I was in and out. My power went out. I don't know what happened, but anyway, I think you made the distinction between welfare and well-being, and if I'm not mistaken, is that correct? Yeah, and I absolutely believe that. But I will say too that in veterinary medicine, we don't talk about well-being. We talk about welfare, and what we talk about are the things that we give animals so that they're free from disease, they have shelter, blah blah blah. But again, you can have welfare in a zoo, in a laboratory, in a livestock containment facility, and that has nothing to do with well-being. But veterinary medicine conflates those terms all the time. And so veterinarians come out thinking that if they give these things to animals, other animals, that has to do with well-being, and they're feeling pretty good about it. So that was just a comment, and I push back on that idea all the time.
Well, I think that's why I make the distinction between welfare being one of conferral, right, and well-being.
Yep. Not being. Yep. No, I've thought that for a long time, and I absolutely agree with that. I also want to say that, I mean, it kind of gets to what Adam was asking. That was the question I was going to ask Adam, is how do you have somebody doing research on dogs, for example, beagles or cats or rodents, rabbits, that kind of, they have a dog at home. They've got a relationship with that dog. And yet when they get into a laboratory, wherever they are, they wall that relationship off and they simply see this animal, one as well, I would say in veterinary medicine, probably most veterinarians I know would absolutely push back. They truly believe that if they're using animals in laboratories, that this is going to benefit people, and so they sort of justify it in that way. And society, on the other hand, justifies it because we don't talk about, what is a leg of lamb. We talk about meat. We talk about milk, and yet it doesn't go beyond that to say what is the animal that's unwillingly donating this body part so that humans can eat. And so what happens is when you start raising these issues, we become the nut jobs, right? We become the nut jobs because society does not want to see that. And so we're the crazy animal people. And I think society does not want us to make that connection. And if we push it, they become very hostile to us. So that was just more of a comment. And, and again, I just, how do we turn that around? I mean, how do we have some truth in advertising? How do we get people to make the connection between what's on their dinner plate and a living animal that's suffering in some horrible condition? It's if I could do that one thing before I die, that would be it, you know?
I would,
And
one thing I'll add to that, Joanne, is it's not just, about, about eating animals or the people who want to push back against our position. So I think about people who probably would who are on board with all of this,
yeah,
right? And so this is the importance of like a reorienting of the science, and because there are animal lovers out there, people who identify as even animal rights people who
yeah,
get enamored when you hear about the science of, oh my God, we showed empathy in rats, or look at this emotional valence shown in these primates or in these bees, they have friendship. But even those people who love animals often don't stop to think about, well, how did we get that information? On whose backs? What were the lives of those rats, those bees, those chimpanzees like? And so even in that community, there is still this sort of aura around that kind of knowledge production. And it's dangerous and it's disingenuous. So I think we also just need to take that veil off and really expose that there is a way to love animals and be enamored with the capacity and the capabilities of animals that doesn't give breath to that kind of research and that kind of science.
yep. No, I'll try to. I'm still not sure how to move forward with that idea, but anyway.
Well, even just keep, again, like this might be a cop out, but I also just think it takes many kinds, right? And I can only do it in the way I can do it. Joanne, you can only
Yeah.
we all contribute something and a different aspect, a different voice, and all of those aspects and those voices are important. So like for me, it's just like I think one, continuing to call this out, make a point of, pausing, right? And talking about that knowledge production, calling out the science, I think is so crucial. Because again, even the animal lovers don't always see it. So I think there's a lot of people out there who are already on side that would be even more on side if they understood the full
Yeah.
implications.
Okay.
Let me go to one of the questions out of chat. This is from Jenny Powell, and Jenny's asking, do you think we will see the use of elephants for entertainment purposes, such as circuses, banned in North America within the next decade?
I mean, I mean, it's I'd like to be able to say yes. It seems like such such a low bar for progress. But, you know, Happy was still a single, a lone, lonely elephant in a premier North American zoo and died that way. So, in the name of good welfare, I might say. Yeah. So I'd like to be able to hold out hope, but I'm not. And I know there are amazing, wonderful people fighting that good fight. I can't make that prediction.
Yeah, I wish Chris Stewart was here with us tonight because she actually worked on that particular case. But I want to draw something out about Happy, and then I'll come to you, Adam. Tell us a little bit from what you know as an expert on elephant well-being in this case, what it would mean for Happy to be all alone for 20 years in that enclosure.
I mean, you have a very social being. I mean, I don't know Happy in particular,
Personally.
so I cannot speak to Happy and who Happy absolutely is. So I am essentializing to a degree. But you have a being that has gone through great trauma in her life. I mean, ripped from her home in Thailand, ripped from her family multiple times over, lost friends, lost loved ones over the years, and then a highly social being kept solitary. I mean, in solitary confinement. You think about the research done with humans in solitary confinement and the great damage. I mean, Joanne can speak, as a veterinarian can speak to this, and Simon's here or was here. Maybe Simon had to leave. But it is a deep, fundamental violation of a duty of care. And there were many other options for Happy, and I mean, not just the philosophical, the legal, the ethical about an animal's life, but for Happy herself to give Happy the opportunity for a truly better life that honored her capacities, that denied her autonomy in the fullest sense. We know she's an agentic being, right? She has that capacity for agency, but that agency, the ability to express that agency over time, the autonomy, was highly constrained. So to me, it's just, an egregious form of violation.
Well, one thing that we know is extended solitary confinement is regarded under the Geneva Conventions as a form of torture for humans. Yeah. Adam, please.
So sorry to add another question, Liv, and happy for others to jump in if they have something to ask. But going to your epistemic ontology framework, to me it looks lovely, and I think as a scientist and you as a scientist, data's lovely and nice, and we all love data. But is it a framework that you see enabling some sort of ability for gathering, measuring an individual's or a population's experiences, and or first defining to your point about an individual is not a species, there's a lot of variation, that variation is going to be context dependent. So what is so for a species, is there for each of the spokes on your wheel of well-being, can we define what a good range is for a particular spoke, and then that range will change based on population or individual, and then we could test between those that are like Happy. You could do an evaluation of Happy and see whether they are falling within for the various spokes, where are they falling within a good range of well-being for happy, or for an individual within a particular context or population. And I wonder if you're doing that work, or if that's the intention, or is that too, yeah, I don't know.
No,
What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is the intention. And that's what I've really has driven my work with the elephants, is trying to see to see if we can. I have a bias as an ethologist, but I think it's a legitimate bias in terms of the sensitivity of behavior, right? I've seen what we can learn from behavior versus even physiological correlates. And like Joanne could probably speak to this as well. But, like there are a lot of physiological correlates that are, they give a coarse view, but behavior gives us that nuance into another that we just can't see with those other types of proxies. I think behavior is like the closest we can get to really understanding another. So it has completely like reshaped my work as an ethologist. My work with the elephants is to, and will say about this, like the spheres, it's not like reinventing the wheel. Like there is a vast amount of knowledge out there, right? Already existing by people with a vast amount of knowledge themselves. There is not just the knowledge, there's the expertise out there to draw from, right? That could absolutely build out each of those spheres, right? In ways that don't violate, right? But can build out those spheres for particular context, right? You think about like an ethogram, so if you know animal behavior, you might not know what an ethogram is, right? It's a catalog or inventory of behavior, but those ethograms kind of contract or protract depending upon what we're paying attention to, what's of interest, what's the point, right? And so you think about, for example, like Joyce Poole's really deep and rich ethogram with African elephants that she and her team have developed over decades, right? Of observing elephants, individual elephants, families, populations, generations of elephants. And it is so specific, but so inclusive at the same time. It is so nuanced that they can include context to the descriptions of those behaviors, the vocalizations, and so forth. So I think I alone am doing, like, no, this is like a full, huge community, but that's the goal, is to bring this community together to say we can develop these spheres of well-being under the umbrella of epistemic ontology, to say we want to know what this means to these animals living their agentic life. So I think it's absolutely doable. I don't think it's like, pie in the sky, far reaching. Yeah.
Have those measures for each of the spheres, like, do you have a sense of what they are? So what's an indice within a particular sphere that gives you a value for that particular sphere? Have you gone to that level yet, or is
in some degree, yeah. So like we have a paper out. So we try to look at indicators of autonomy, behavioral indicators of autonomy with the elephants, and they pull out from behaviors that are relevant to each of those spheres. So people who know Asian elephants, who know these Asian elephants, we sat down and we talked about, like, okay, well, what are the essentially behavioral proxies for these that would be meaningful, right, for us to make some determination about autonomous expression in these elephants. So I would say to a modest degree, we've been developing that. But that's, think about all of the many animals that we could do this for when it's appropriate to do it for them and in ways that's appropriate to do it.
And just in response to that, it's making me think about a talk I went to recently about climate change and thermoregulation in there was some work with salmon. Actually, you mentioned salmon in your talk, and they were talking about how they were looking at physiological changes in salmon in relation to climate change, and there is evidence of that occurring at different stages of salmon's life, and there was this conversation in the room about so will salmon be able to adapt quickly enough to changing climates? And the conclusion was probably not. But it seems like behavioral behavior is far more plastic than physiology, but we don't necessarily have a good understanding of much behavior. So for a salmon in a hot stream, you can go over to the edge and sit in the shade rather than be in the middle of the hot stream, for instance. And that might change the temperature by degrees rather than waiting generations for physiological adaptation. But we don't really have. I suppose the behavioural aspect of this study was so brief and so small and didn't really recognise the agency of the fish to maybe change within their environment. And I wonder whether this sort of tool that you're developing may be useful in many spheres of science, where we could get a greater understanding of animals and who they are and their agency, and how they enact their agency, and then do comparative research in relation to climate change and environmental degradation, all these sorts of things.
Right.
But yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes, I'd love to hear what you think, Joanne, if you have thoughts on this or others that I don't know in terms of your areas of knowledge. But again, going back to the sensitivity of behavior, if we're paying attention, I do think behavior, there are precursors that we don't, where we could get those indications are on display, but we're often not paying attention to them. And sometimes we don't have the opportunity. Maybe there's not that's not available to us. But I think we're blunted. We've taught ourselves to be pretty shut down when it comes to paying attention to behavior within our own species and definitely with others.
There's something about epistemic ontology that reminds me very much of hermeneutics, in terms of being an interpretive perspective. And I suppose one of the challenges here is avoiding the spheres of well-being becoming a typology that is simply characterized by a set of indices instead of an interpretive practice for which the indices can be helpful, but they're just aids, heuristic aids to the interpretation. Because we all know an indice can mean one thing or another, depending on, the individual's intention or the experience or the context. It's one of the reasons why surrogate variables in so-called behavioral social science work so poorly to describe, to explain, to evaluate what it is that human beings do. Which leads me to a question, and I'm coming to you, Robin. I see you up there. How, in the social sciences, there is those who identify themselves as the behaviorists in the social sciences still are operating in that very fragmented, analytic, typological way of thinking about human beings, even right down to thinking that human beings are simply sophisticated sets of programming that think that they're self-aware. And then there's others, many of my friends, and Ralph, jump in here at some point if you want to mention this or get into this. see human beings as completely disconnected from their bodies, their consciousness, something wholly created through a social process, so-called social construction, and not an epistemic ontology. They're constantly breaking those two things apart. And you're really integrating in a way that hermeneuticists have done through things like fusion of horizons and forms of life, etc., which leads me to ask, how is it that animal welfare scientists are coming along themselves overall in this debate between these rigid reductivist ways of thinking about animal well-being and animal knowing versus those who just want to see these as all social constructions of, let's say, the animals and not connected with their larger ontology as your and their entanglement with that broad notion of ontology, ecology, social, experiential that you articulated?
Well, I think if we're talking about animal welfare science or animal welfare scientists, I think, like I said, I think there's this progress, right, in understanding the lives of animals, their deep capabilities, their capacities. You see that in the developing models of animal welfare from, going from the five freedoms to eventually, five domains to positive welfare to models around emotion. But in practice, right, and I think I made this point in the talk, is that it's like the principle, the idea, the theory is over there, the understanding, but how it plays out in practice for the animals is something very different. And I don't think there is a real translation for even those, right, who believe it, right? I don't think they're often translating it to if they're a practitioner of animal welfare science, if they're a scientist of other kinds, an ethologist, I don't think it's being translated and put into practice. There hasn't been a real, I would say, transformation that way. I think that's my short answer to that question.
I appreciate that.
And I think, I know you've talked about scientism a lot, Bill, but I think there still is this deference to a type of science, to a type of data, to a type of knowledge that it's just exhausting, frankly, for someone like me, and I know for a lot of you here, that to constantly hear that, and when where has it gotten us in many respects, and what has it really taught us about other beings, and so I think there's still I think that deference needs to be just, frankly, I'd be very happy if it were completely destroyed, because I think it's extremely damaging, and I think it limits us in terms of our creativity. I don't know if that answers your question.
That does. That does. Thank you. Robin, please, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
No, that's right. That's a good point to follow, because the question I was going to say before Adam sort of took it from me involved how science really doesn't like uncertainty. And so I like that this sort of frames that in a more forward-thinking way. But I do want to, first of all, say thank you for bringing forth concepts that just resonate so deeply in such an eloquent way that it's just like, it feels so right. And the thing that I was wondering that how it fits into what I understand is already an extremely complex network of understanding, right? There's so many pieces at play. And there's so much diversity already inherent when you're looking at different individuals in different contexts across time, all the different things that change. How does this concept fit and this ontology fit in the multi-species context that animals are living in when they're well-being is going to be tied with those relationships that are also going to be different in the context they're in. If an animal happens to be in captivity, the other animals that they might be able to engage with and how those relationships fill that need.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It is squarely in play, right? Who is in relation with the animals, if you have animals in question or individuals in question, but they're interacting, engaging in varying ways, right? And we, like with the elephants, human elephant interaction is, we're always paying attention to that, right? We're not excluding the humans in their world from our understanding of them, because that is part of their community, and we would be negligent to do so. So the epistemic ontology is absolutely one of multi-species mixed communities. It has to be, right? To say it isn't would be to also deny, to take away that social complexity, that environmental complexity from animals who are living those multi-species mixed community lives all the time. And we often, we have our blinders on, we don't want to see it, or it's too inconvenient, or it's too complicated. But 100%, Robin, like that, like, and to me, that's exciting, right? Because it's more truthful, it's more honest about their lives. So bring it on. Absolutely.
May I ask a follow-up to that then?
Yeah.
So one of the arguments I hear a lot about animals in captivity is that they are free of certain multi-species interactions, namely they're free of parasites. They're free of things that might harm them. They don't have to worry about predators. And I'm curious just sort of what your response would be. I know I'm not giving you easy questions here, but recognizing that you said in your presentation that a good life is not a life well lived is not a life without difficulty. I had to write it down because I enjoyed it so much. And where that fits in when it is, it's not just difficulty, it is a form of actual harm that they can experience in this sort of relationship. So I'm just curious what you would say to those folks.
Well, this is where we as humans need to check our colonial mindset, our paternalistic mindset, before we go in and really stomp out the life of a agentic being, right? To deny them that expression of agency, the autonomous life, right? And if we could, remove all suffering from the world for humans, for all other species, in a way that doesn't mean that we're severing their relationships or fundamentally changing them, I would probably vote for that. You have to be careful of the monkey's paw, right? But let's just say we could do it. I think most of us find suffering difficult to contend with. But to go in and say, I'd rather you be in my notion of captivity, of a safe life, at the expense of you living a life. I mean, that is not humility. That is not granting another the full expression of self, the full expression of life. It's anthropocentric. It's the other side of that anthropocentric coin. Those who just want to use and harm and feel okay doing that and dominate. But then there's that other side of the anthropocentrism that we have the right to tailor an individual's life because it feels right to us. And that goes back to like when Bill asked me about the drag chains, right? Thinking about what we are projecting onto another, what we think is right for them or good for them, when we're not often willing to step back and say, what is good for them? If I care, if I want to know these animals, this animal, what is good for them? What is a good life for them? And captivity is usually not the answer.
We have time for perhaps one more question. Is there someone out there who has a comment or a question they'd like to share?
Oh, I see Trish is here. Hi, Trish. I don't know if you're there or if you're actually listening. Trish is an excellent veterinarian who's done a lot of work with elephants.
Oh, really? Okay, cool. Trish, did you have something?
I
you
don't want
wanted
to call them out because sometimes
say?
people are.
Well, I'm happy to call them out.
Well.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi,
Oh,
Trish.
Hi.
I didn't know if you were busy. I didn't want to.
No.
on the
No,
spot.
it's good to see you. This talk was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for attending. It means a great deal. Thanks,
Yes. No, it's so great. You are so eloquent with your words of putting things I see and feel, and saying it so well.
Thanks, Trish.
Yes, you definitely.
Well, you're an inspiration, so I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you. I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Thank you, Trish. Appreciate it. Well, I think we're at a point where it's probably time to wrap up. But before we do, Liv, I don't want to wrap up without giving you a chance to pitch and just talk a little bit about your forthcoming book on this very subject.
Be on the lookout for a book on wild animal welfare and well-being that speaks to epistemic ontology and the spheres of well-being. And Bill and Adam, I have chapters in the book along with many other wonderful authors, and that's the best pitch I can do, Bill.
Okay, that's a great pitch. That's a great pitch. Look, thank you all for being here with us tonight. We're going to sign off now, but please, pay attention to our future episodes that are coming out. We'll be sending you communications about that. And thank you for joining PanWorks.
Thanks, everyone.
PanThinks is a production of PanWorks, an ethics, science, and policy think tank for the well-being of animals. It is edited and produced by Gary Shear with the help of Bill Lynn. To learn more about PanWorks, visit our website at panworks.io. To donate to our work, please visit our support page on our website. Until next time, this is PanWorks, bringing ethics to life.